So Ben Aldiss is a world expert on wasps of the yellow jacket kind, and he's going to tell us lots of interesting things about wasps tonight. And I think that your title for the evening is "Who's Afraid of the Big Bang?" Wasp.
Correct. Thank you very much. And welcome, everybody. Yes, I did my PhD on wasps, but prior to that, I was an ecologist insofar as I did my first degree in ecology at Royal Holloway College, what used to be London University then. And I knew from the age of 16, really, that I wanted to do a PhD on insects, because at the age of 2, my father caught me opening his cabinet of pinned butterflies. He collected butterflies well into his 80s. Anyway, at 2 years old, I was well into the bottom drawer of his cabinet of butterflies and was eating all the blue ones off their pins, apparently. So he said that was the first inkling that he had of my interest in insects. Anyway, I decided that I would like to do a PhD of some sort on insects. And when I had finished my degree at Royal Holloway, which included quite a bit of entomology, but also quite a bit of botany, I thought pollination would be a good thing to work on. I couldn't get the money for that, but I did notice in New Scientist magazine that they were advertising for a PhD at the Chemical Entomology Unit at Southampton University, and they wanted somebody to work on wasps, the alarm behavior of wasps. Well, not a very popular topic, I think. But anyway, I applied for that and was interviewed both at Southampton and at Rentokil, because they had a vested interest, not so much in the alarm behavior, but they wanted me to work on wasp attractants. So my PhD had 2 facets to it. The more academic facet, looking at the alarm behavior and trying to find an attractant that, as Rentokil put it, would attract wasps into traps away from chocolate factories and bakeries and things like that. So it was very interesting, the contrast. When it came to writing up my doctorate, it posed a bit of a problem, because initially I was going to write it in 2 bits. But no, my supervisor said I had to amalgamate it all into chemical communication and write a general conclusion to tie the 2 together, which I did. Now, this logo was designed by one of my daughters. Both of them are artists, and this one's, she sent me this as a birthday card one year. Some people might have been rather put out to receive that, but I wasn't at all. It took me quite a few years, considering I'm an entomologist, to discover that she'd only given it 5 legs. And I have a feeling that most of us actually, is from about up to the number 4, we more or less take note of the number, but anything over 4, and we don't really notice, because I would have thought I was bound to notice being an entomologist, but no, I didn't. Nor did she. She was a bit put out, but I said, no, it didn't matter. It's a brilliant wasp. Wasps, of course, are very emotive. And in 2018, I had started, having retired from lecturing and teaching, I had started lecturing on cruise ships as a sort of pastime. And I was in the middle of the Adriatic in August 2018 when I got a call from the comment editor of the Daily Telegraph saying, would I write a piece pro-wasps, basically, in support of wasps, because it was such a bad wasp summer. Bad from most people's point of view, but good from mine. And he said, there must be something good you can say about wasps. So I dashed to the ship's library, and luckily I knew what I wanted to write, so I just wrote it off in about an hour and emailed it from the ship, and it was in the next morning's Daily Telegraph. And Bob did a cartoon to go with it, which is rather nice, and you can possibly see there that there's a wasp with Theresa May's head, a bumblebee with Boris Johnson's head, and a dung beetle with Jeremy Corbyn's head. But I entitled that "Don't Kill Wasps, They Keep Our Countryside Beautiful." And I'll come back to my theory on that a bit later. Well, this wasn't my title, actually. Somebody here decided on that. I'm not sure if it was somebody did, but I went with it because it's fair enough. I sometimes have the title, "Should We Be Afraid of Wasps?" Because so many people are. And in fact, I myself was very trepidatious when I started this PhD, because I thought, what have I let myself in for? It's all very well doing a PhD, perhaps in history or French or something like that, and you can have quite a comfortable time with it. But I knew that parts of this research were going to be difficult and possibly a bit challenging, and certainly possibly dangerous too. Well, who is afraid of wasps? Quite a few people, I imagine. Could you put your hands up if you've been stung by one, a wasp? That's nearly everybody. Right, thank you. What about bees? Have any of you been stung by bees? Oh, roughly the same number, perhaps fewer. Well, I'm going to explain why more people are stung by wasps than by bees. When I was doing my research, it became very evident to me that my colleague, who was doing similar research on bees, i.e. trying to find out about their alarm behavior, honeybees that is, he was stung on average once a week over 3 years. Well, I was stung just 3 times in 3.5 years in my research, and I was often surrounded by swarms of wasps. So I did discover very quickly 1 or 2 things that all of you need to know about avoiding wasps. Well, if wasps were that big, we should definitely be afraid, because, of course, wasps and other insects are incredibly successful. And it's just very lucky that through their anatomy, they effectively can't get any bigger than a certain size. And it's largely to do with the rate of diffusion of respiratory gases. It's very lucky for us that they don't get any bigger, because I don't think we would be here. In fact, I know we wouldn't be here if wasps were this big. This one is Vespula vulgaris. And, oh, that's interesting. I thought that was the pointer.
The pointer is the one in the middle.
Oh, right. Oh yes, there. This marking here on the fronds of the wasp, the front of its face, is diagnostic. It's one of the diagnostic features of Vespula vulgaris, the common wasp. It's very often anchor-shaped, much more so than this. It has flukes on either side. And that distinguishes it from the other very common wasp, the German wasp, which is equally common in southern Britain. And it's these 2 species that are the real pest ones. I'll talk about all the others as well. But notice 1 or 2 very important features here. First of all, the jaws and their teeth. They are very strong jaws. And when you do research on wasps, occasionally you get bitten by them. I don't know if you've been bitten by a wasp as well as stung, but they can certainly bite. Another feature, very important, is this wonderful compound eye, which isn't oval. It goes round the corner here and gets thin and widens out again round the top. It's actually kidney-shaped, which is very strange, and it does make us wonder just what they do see in the world compared to us. What we do know is they have eyesight equally as good as ours. They can see in a range of colours. They can't see red, but they can see ultraviolet. And they have 3 smaller eyes between the 2 big ones at the top, which I'll come back to. Right, what I'm going to talk about is under these headings. What are wasps and why do we hate them? I'm assuming most of you, well, possibly you don't hate them, otherwise you might not be here at this talk. But certainly you're probably wary. Then I'm going to look at the British social wasps. Then the invaders, and those are the ones that have entered our country since I did my research. From about, my research was 1976 to 80. I got an extra 6 months from the Science Research Council to do my research because I argued that it was a stupid time to start a studentship, October, when the wasp season is virtually over. And I needed an extra 6 months in the summer to really finish off my research, and they kindly let me do that and paid for it. Anyway, from about 1985, other wasps entered the country, and I'll talk more about those. How do you study wasps? I'm going to explain a bit about how I did my research. Why do they sting, and what can we do to avoid them? Now, that's probably of great interest to you. And what use are wasps? The number of times I'm asked that very question, what use are wasps? When, of course, they've lived on this earth for millions of years longer than we have, so they have every right to be here. But people seem to think that, you know, if they're no use to us, then we should get rid of them. Well, getting rid of them would be a very, very difficult thing to do. In my view, long after we have gone from the earth, there'll be rats and wasps amongst the animals. They'll be very, very successful still. Anyway, I'm going to give you 10 reasons why I think we should appreciate them. And then I will ask the question again, should we be afraid of wasps? Okay, well, I don't know how many of you are entomologists. Hands up if you are, right? Okay, well, you will know the answer to this question. But the difference between bees and wasps is actually quite, I think, very, very important in discovering why we are stung more likely by wasps than by bees. Bees, and those are 2 of them at the top there, the honeybee at the top left and a bumblebee on the top right. They have long tongues and they're herbivores. And those are 2 very, very important points. With their long tongues, they can reach the nectar in any flower, more or less. And that provides them with their source of carbohydrate, of course. In the case of the honeybee, they make big stores of honey to last them over the winter, and that's why they can produce perennial colonies. Bumblebees are annual, and they produce a very small amount of honey that just tides them over during inclement weather in the summer. But both sorts of bees have long tongues, and so they can exploit flowers. The carbohydrates are really the source of energy for the adults. The adults don't grow. You probably know that once an insect has reached adulthood, it's effectively the size it's going to be, more or less. Okay, a praying mantis, I've had many pet praying mantises, and the females especially do appear to grow the more they eat, but that's just a sort of slight expansion rather than true growth. So adult bees and wasps need a source of carbohydrate for energy because they do use up a lot of energy and they generate a lot of heat. If you've ever put your hand into a beehive, are any of you apiarists or, well, or a wasp's nest, and I've put my hands into lots of wasps' nests with gloves on. They are incredibly warm. They're about 40 degrees Celsius, and that is generated by the wasps themselves. So they've got to have a source of energy. Protein, on the other hand, is largely required by the larvae, and that is for growth. And that's where wasps and bees are very different. Bees are purely herbivorous. They get their protein to feed the larvae from pollen in flowers. Wasps get their protein from prey. They chew up prey and take it back to the nest. This, some of you might recognize, the wood wasp, one of Britain's largest insects. It's a solitary wasp, and it looks pretty fierce. It's got this spike, which is just really part of the ovipositor. It actually braces the ovipositor as the female is laying its eggs in rotten pine logs, and its larva feeds on the rotten wood and takes about 3 years to come to adulthood. The reason this insect, when it's fully grown, is black and yellow is because it is trying to mimic one of the more dangerous species of wasp, so that a bird or other creature is likely to think twice about challenging it. So that's a solitary wasp. This is another social wasp, and that's Vespula germanica. I worked on both those species. Germanica has just a dot on the fronds there, or 3 dots, or a triangle, but never an anchor-shaped mark. There are other differences too. The nest structure, for instance, is different. But both Vulgaris and Germanica produce big colonies, 25 to 30,000 wasps in a colony in the course of a summer. Now, this is a video sequence I took with my phone. It just shows how good phones are these days. And this shows another mimic of the common wasp. The male, there is a male common wasp, Vespula vulgaris, and you can see he's got long antennae that curl backwards and a longer abdomen than the female. He's mimicking her because he can't sting. The sting is a modified ovipositor, so obviously males don't have it. This one, though, is a female. She's a worker, and she does have the pointed abdomen with a sting and shorter antennae. Incidentally, that fly buzzing around is a commensal of wasps. It lives, its larvae live in the midden at the bottom of a wasp's nest. Right, social and solitary wasps. This one is a social wasp. It's not a British one. That's a Polistes species. We do have a Polistes one in Britain now. It's cropping up more and more, but not this particular one. But this is in the same family as Vespula vulgaris and Germanica. And it creates colonies, small ones, only 50 to 100 strong. But the crucial thing about social wasps is that there is an overlap of generations. They get to know their offspring, and the offspring in a nest are all, or mostly, sisters until the autumn. I'll come back to that a bit later. This is grouped as a solitary wasp. It's actually an ichneumon, and some of you might recognize it. It's called Rissa persuasoria, and it's our largest ichneumon, and it is a parasite, or yes, a parasitoid, it should officially be called. And its prey is the wood wasp that you saw in the previous slide. And this creature can detect with these antennae where the larva is, even some centimeters below the surface of the pine log that the larva is in. And it then lays its egg, guided by this incredibly long sheath there that goes from the tip of the abdomen through a groove in the legs and into the wood. And she then drills a hole and passes an egg through a very, very slim tube down to where the larva is. And that its larva then eats the wood wasp larva and it hatches as one of these. So these don't actually ever meet their offspring. The only ones that they will meet are their opposite number when they mate, and then that's a very short affair, and otherwise there's no overlap at all. You might have noticed that the wings of wasps seem impossibly skinny when they're walking up a window pane, for instance. Well, that's because when they're not in use, the wasps fold them lengthwise, which is quite an interesting way, a very neat way of keeping them in good order. And you might well know that wasps, along with most insects, have actually 4 wings, not just 2. The hind wings of wasps are very small and they're hooked permanently to the front ones. The biggest wasp in the world is the giant Japanese hornet, and that really is a huge thing. The one on the right is on an adult's hand, and the head of that worker hornet is the size of one of our honeybees. And honeybees are some of their favorite prey. I corresponded with a Professor Matsuura of Tokyo University when I was doing my research. And he wrote to me very excitedly one day to say that he'd witnessed 30 of these hornets killing a hive of around 30,000 honeybees in 3.5 hours. And what they do is they hover outside the hive, and the guard bees fearlessly rush out despite the huge size difference, and they chase the hornet. The hornet then flies slightly further away, then turns round in midair, grabs the honeybee and chops its head and its abdomen off, and then repeats the process. And once that had happened, the hornets got more recruitments and came into the hive, took the larvae of the bees out, chewed them up and fed them to their own larvae, and of course raided the honey as well. So they are very big creatures, and the queen is half as big again. And just by comparison, the brown hornets found in the tropics are roughly the same size as our European hornet. So that will give you another idea as just how big the giant Japanese hornet is. And that, again, is a worker. I'm sure you've all heard of the Asian hornet, which is on the verge of being a real problem in Britain. I'm going to come back to that later, but that's an Asian hornet dismembering a honeybee. And then I thought I'd talk a bit about yellow jackets as well. You mentioned yellow jackets, Stuart. That's what the Americans call wasps. And so this is an American species, which I'm going to come back to at the very end. Rather smart with its vertical stripes, longitudinal stripes on its thorax there. And the queen of this species is a sort of orange color. The Americans have a number of wasps that are very closely related to ours, and I dealt with various researchers in the States because they were very keen on finding an attractant for wasps, much more so than we were in Britain. I was only one of 3 wasp experts at the time I did my research in Britain, and there are very few now. There are only 2 others that I know of in Britain at the moment. One of them has got a copy of my thesis. I went to see her in London. Anyway, the Americans have a very interesting one, a vescular species, which is not black and yellow, but black and white. And that they call the bald-faced hornet. It isn't a hornet, it's smaller. Hornets are really just large wasps. Their Latin name is Vespa, meaning wasp, and the Latin name of the smaller wasps is vespula, meaning little wasp. I was thrilled to find one of these. This is a photo I took actually in Greece. My family and I used to drive to Greece every summer because we had long summer holidays, and we'd go on camping trips to the far-flung parts of Europe, mainly for me to find creepy crawlies, and my children loved to help. Well, the oriental hornet shouldn't have been found in Greece. This was about 15 years ago, I suppose. It was really restricted to the Middle East and India, that sort of area. But now it is found in southern Europe. And in fact, I have found it in southern France. It's a beautiful creature, a sort of maroon color with lemon yellow. But apparently it's a total plague when you're trying to pick dates in places like Israel and other parts of the Middle East. It loves dates and will do anything to try and stop other things from getting them. Okay, the British social wasps then. These were the ones in black that were around when I did my research. And the two that I researched on specifically were the common and the German wasp. But the European hornet, of course, is one. And then you've got the red wasp, the cuckoo wasp, the Norwegian wasp, and the tree wasp. Since about 1985, those ones in purple have entered Britain. Now, some people think that's a clear sign of global warming, but in my view, it's nothing to do with that at all. It's actually to do with the increased communication across the channel, the huge increase in transport of all kinds across the channel. And you only need a hibernating queen to stow away in luggage, in a ship or a car or a lorry, and for it to get to our country at the right time of year, i.e. spring, for the potential for an invasion to take place. Because the queens mate in the autumn, the new queens, and there are about 500 new queens per nest of vulgaris or germanica. Those 500 queens mate, they stoke up on fuel for the winter by feeding on late flowering plants that do have a supply of nectar they can reach, or they get it from rotting fruit, that sort of thing. And they hibernate for 6 months, and they have enough sperm stored in them to tide them over for the entire rest of their existence. So they can populate a colony of, as I say, up to 30,000 wasps just from the sperm they have stored. Now, for most of the year, it's just females that are produced. The queen starts the nest off, and for the first 6 weeks, she does everything herself. She builds the nest, she lays the eggs, she rears the larvae, feeds them, gets water, etc. So for that 6 weeks, she's very, very vulnerable. As soon as the first workers, though, are adult, they then take over the duties outside the nest. So the queen can then stay in the nest and lay eggs. And from that time onwards, the fate of the colony is more or less assured. It's going to survive. So you can see that all you need is a hibernating queen to stow away and get to our country at the right time of year, and then potentially she can start up a colony. And so I think that's basically what's happened. I'll quickly go through the different sorts that we have. This is the European hornet, and they're really quite common around here. I imagine most of you have seen them, possibly even had a nest in your garden, perhaps. In my view, they're not a huge problem. Hornets are not actually nearly as attracted to the sorts of things that our common wasps are. So they don't normally bother us, but they do have a lower light threshold than wasps. So they can actually forage on a moonlit night. So if in weather like this, you have windows open and lights on in your house, and you've got a hornet's nest nearby, you could quite easily get hornets coming in just like moths and buzzing around the light. And that's when you are likely to get stung. There's the common wasp with its telltale anchor-shaped marking. The German wasp, and this one's on a plum, drinking plum juice. And this shows a feature that I was mentioning, the fact that its tongue is very short. The tongue is behind that drop of juice, but it literally is just as long as that. So about 10 times shorter than the tongue of a bumblebee or a honeybee. The red wasp is one of our rarer wasps, and you can quite clearly see why it's called the red wasp. And this one is actually taking nectar from an umbellifer, lady's lace, and that is a sort of flower that it can reach. Any flower that's shallow enough is potentially a good source of nectar for wasps, but you don't see wasps actually visiting flowers very much for nectar. More often than not, they'll be visiting flowers like this to catch the insects that are on them, the other insects. This is our rarest wasp, and there's a very good reason for that, and it's in the name. As you all know, the cuckoo is a social parasite or a brood parasite. It takes an egg out of another bird's nest and replaces it with its own, and the parent birds then rear the young cuckoo, which tips all the other eggs or chicks out of the nest, so it's the only one in the nest, and the foster parents just slavishly look after it. Well, the cuckoo wasp, the queen hibernates for 6 weeks longer than all the others. The others come out around about mid-March in the south of England. This comes out in May. And the reason is that it's a social parasite on the red wasp. So it has to find a red wasp nest when the nest has already produced workers. And that takes about 6 weeks to happen. She can find the red wasp nest, which is underground. She can find that by her sense of smell, her antennae. And she goes down into the nest and stings the red wasp queen to death. And she's got a longer curved sting, and she's got a thicker exoskeleton compared to the queen that she's stinging. And so invariably she wins. And the workers, the red wasp workers, immediately just follow her bidding. So she presumably has very similar pheromones to the queen that she has just stung. And so she only produces males and queens. She doesn't ever produce her own workers. The Norwegian wasp is found, as its name suggests, more northerly parts, and so it tends to replace Vulgaris and Germanica further north in Britain. This one is visiting one of the few flowers that is actually adapted for wasp pollination, and this you'll recognize if you're a gardener is Cotoneaster or Cotoneaster. And it's got very small pinkish flowers, and it seems that wasp-pollinated flowers tend to be pinkish or reddish, which so quite how they see them we don't know, or I don't know, because they can't see red as such. But I do have a theory about that. Anyway, this one is visiting a flower for nectar. The Norwegian wasp produces very small nests, and most of the other species that I've mentioned produce small nests compared to the common and the German wasp. This one too produces small nests, the tree wasp. And nowadays, with lots of people having bird nesting boxes in their garden, the tree wasp very often nests in those. So if you ever have a wasp's nest in a bird nesting box, it's likely to be the tree wasp. It's a very handsome wasp. You can see it's a jet black with lemon yellow, very shiny. And its colonies only last until about the end of July. So they're never really a problem to us. Vespula vulgaris and germanica, though, their nests go way into October, November, or even December. And I have, during my research, had one nest that's still having workers coming in and out in January. So it's those that are the wasps that cause us the greatest problems, and they produce the biggest colonies. The invaders, these ones that I think have come across in transport over from France, the paper wasp, Polistes. My children have been stung by these quite a lot. When we go on camping holidays, or when we went on camping holidays, we'd invariably stumble across one of these nests because they're very strange nests. I don't know if any of you have seen them, but they're made of paper like the nests of Vulgaris and Germanica, but they're very small. They're only 50 to 100 cells, and they're built sideways onto a fairly rigid support, a branch of a shrub, for instance, but at very low heights, round about sort of knee height in grassy areas usually. Just the sort of place a young child would rush about in a campsite or on the edge of a campsite, and that's how they got stung. This is the distribution currently of the paper wasp in Britain. Probably vastly under-recorded because the colonies are so small, and most people, if they see something black and yellow, aren't going to assume it's something new, so they probably wouldn't report it. The Saxon wasp, that's here now in greater numbers. It's not a particular problem. This is a male, and you can tell because of his long curly antennae. He's also got quite a long face. There's a subgenus of Vespula called Dolicho-Vespula, and Dolicho refers to the long face of these wasps. That's its distribution. Then we've got the killer wasp. One of the newspapers, the tabloids, in 1985 hit upon this and called it the killer wasp because it had come apparently from France, and almost certainly it had. It produces large colonies, about the same size as Vespula, Germanica, and Vulgaris, but instead of the usual place that we find those nests, and I haven't mentioned that yet, but Vulgaris and Germanica, 70% of their nests are actually underground. That might surprise you. We normally think of them being in roof spaces, for instance, in sheds and things like that, but actually mostly they're underground, in disused rodent burrows, that sort of thing. So you find them in lawns in August and September quite frequently. But the killer wasp, it suspends its nests in shrubs at about head height usually. And they grow to about the size of, well, much bigger than a football. And they contain up to 10,000 wasps at any given time, and over the course of the summer, 25 to 30,000, as in the case of the common and the German. So they're big colonies, they last well into the autumn, and that's the problem. Round about August or September, if you were going into your garden and you hadn't noticed the nest, and you actually wouldn't necessarily notice the nest, even though there were wasps flying from it to and fro a lot, you wouldn't notice it until you started pruning the bush it was in. And that's the key point, because one of the things I discovered in my research was that if you're within 3 meters of the colony and you get stung, well, if you disturb the nest, they rush out to see what's happening. And if you get stung, there's a pheromone given off that causes others to home in and attack within that 3-meter radius. So you are very likely to get multiple stings. And sadly, some people died as a result of multiple stings from this wasp. So that's why the tabloids call it the killer wasp. It's no more dangerous, actually, than the common or the German. But now that people know that they shouldn't prune in August or September without checking that there isn't a wasp's nest first, fewer people are suffering. Very interestingly, these are all from the same colony. This wasp produces multiple coloured wasps, different colour variants in the same colony and different sizes. So this one could certainly be a hornet. It looks very similar to a hornet. And these are very black, and you get some that are black and yellow as well. And it's now relatively common in Britain. It's in France, it's called the median wasp, Vespula media. This is the queen nest of a killer wasp, the queen nest being the one that the founding queen starts off. She does all the work herself, so the wood pulp that she gets is all the same color because she goes back to the same source time and time again. A very strange thing about the killer wasp is that the queen produces this entrance tube at the base of the nest, which the workers then pull apart when they build the nest bigger, but it's not found in any other Vespula species. And then the Norwegian wasp's nest on the right. Again, these are not big colonies, so they're not usually a problem. The Asian hornet, or yellow-footed hornet, this was brought over in a consignment of porcelain from China in 2004 to Bordeaux. And exactly what I said is likely to have happened with our invaders happened there. A queen hornet was hibernating in the ship. The ship happened to arrive in Bordeaux in spring. The queen hornet escaped. As far as we know, there was only one. And she produced a colony because, of course, she was already fertilized. She produced around 500 queens that year, and the rest is history. It spread throughout France very quickly. It's now found in Italy, Germany, Austria, Spain, Portugal, and the Channel Islands. On some of my talks on cruise ships, I've been approached by people from Jersey, particularly saying, what are we going to do about the Asian hornet? Last year, they had 60 nests on the island of Jersey. Those were just the ones they located, and it's very difficult to know what to do about them. They have now reached mainland Britain, and their main prey, when they can get it, is honeybees. So beekeepers are justly worried. And also, I'm not totally sure of this, but this 3-meter limit that I was mentioning from the nest is bigger, I think, in the Asian hornet. So you stand a chance of getting multiple stings if you're further away from the nest. And they hang their nests in trees, usually. Some of them are underground, but most are in trees. How do you study wasps? Well, very carefully. Obviously, my first thoughts were, how do I do this? Because there were very few wasp researchers anywhere in the world, it wasn't easy to find out. I certainly didn't have any real help at the university because people were working on things like leafcutter ants and honeybees, yes, but not wasps. Well, I decided I needed a vespiary. And this is me. Somebody reckoned I looked like Princess Anne dressed like that. But I didn't particularly care what I looked like as long as I was protected from the wasp stings. So that's me in my beekeeper's outfit. And I set up this system where I had 4 nest boxes that I designed that forced the wasps to build their nests horizontally rather than vertically. And I put a glass bottom on these nest boxes and then a hardboard sliding bottom on top of that so that it would be in darkness, but I could take the slide out and look up through the glass to see what was going on. I had 4 nests, 3 of which could forage randomly, but the nest behind this one had a foraging arena, I called it. This was the Mark 1, which was not very impressive looking, but I replaced it with Dexion girders, and so it was rigid and really looked quite smart. I didn't get a photo of that, unfortunately. But anyway, it meant that I could see what the wasps were doing when they were foraging. And I'll come back to that as well. This is not a great photo. It was contemporary, obviously, black and white, but you can see that there's use this. You can see I've got a length of bamboo, which I cut from the university garden, another piece of bamboo lashed to it, and then cotton, black cotton, and a dental roll, one of those things dentists put in your mouth to keep your mouth open and dry. And 25 centimeters apart from it, I hung another one. So I had one as the control and one as my treated object. And this is in front of a wasp's nest at Havant in Hampshire. This pole was 3 meters long, because by then I'd had a pretty good idea that I was safe if I was 3 meters away from the nest. And bearing in mind, my main aim in my alarm behavior experiments was to try and aggravate the wasps. I was going to make sure I was not too close to them. And so I also wore a white lab coat. Now, at this particular site, it was very amusing. I would stand there day after day for 8 hours at a time, counting the number of attacks that I got on one of these compared to the other. And people would be walking past on the pavement that was very close by, and I couldn't really stop to tell them what I was doing, so they were really intrigued. And one day, this was in the vicarage garden, one day I was doing my research and I heard this commotion behind me, and I glanced behind me and I saw this man jump onto the neighbour's wall and into the vicarage garden. It was a big garden, and he started running across the lawn towards me very fast, and suddenly a policeman jumped over the wall as well and rugger tackled this guy behind me, and here was I just carrying on doing my research. And anyway, this fugitive was frisked and held up against the vicarage wall and handcuffed, and apparently he'd escaped from the police station jail. I don't know what he'd done, but anyway, the policeman caught him. But it was only then that the policeman thought, what's this guy doing? Because I appeared for all the world as if I was fishing. It looked as if I'd got a fishing rod, miles from any water. Anyway, it was fine in the end, but he did come up to me almost with his notepad and pencil and say, what have we here, you know, what are you up to? But luckily I got the department van next to me, and it showed that I was from Southampton University, so that was fine. Right, well, what I did with that apparatus was, I thought, well, how do I find out if there's an alarm pheromone? Because nobody knew whether wasps had an alarm pheromone. And the definition of a pheromone is a chemical that alters the behavior of another of the same species. So I was going to try and prove that wasps had a pheromone that elicited an attack response. So the first thing I did was to catch one of the wasps coming out of the nest and crush it onto one of these dental rolls. so that the juices from the wasp went into the cotton wool, and then I made sure there were no bits of wasp left on it, so it looked the same as the other dental roll, the control, and then I dangled them in front of the nest, and I capped the cane to make them jig up and down. And to my great excitement, there was a huge attack on the one that had got the juice from the wasp on it, but hardly any attacks at all on the control one. So I thought, right, there is an alarm pheromone. And obviously I had to repeat these experiments at different nests. And gradually I narrowed it down. I took the thorax of a wasp and crushed that on the head and the abdomen, and I narrowed it down to the abdomen. I then took a binocular microscope out into the field, and I made miniature dissecting instruments out of matchsticks and entomological pins, and I dissected wasps to get this apparatus out, the venom sac and the Dufour's gland. And I proved that the pheromone came from the venom sac. It was absolutely indisputable by doing those sorts of research techniques. Incidentally, I used to play squash at the time with the professor of nuclear physics at Southampton University, and one day he said, "Do you realize how ironic it is that here are we two playing squash? My research involves the particle accelerator at CERN in Switzerland and costs millions of pounds, and you've got two bamboo canes." But I got results. And one of the important chemical techniques I used was chromatography. Just to remind you what it is, this is the sort that people do in schools to separate inks. For instance, you have the solvent, the stationary phase here, and then you've got the liquid phase moving upwards, and it separates the pigments. Well, I used gas liquid chromatography, where you've got a column, a glass column that's 3 meters long, and it's packed with silica gel, and on that you have a liquid phase. I used something called Carbowax or OV101, and this was in an oven that you could program, and you injected your sample into it, and that's how I started to find out what the components of the venom of wasps were. And you get a chromatogram as a result. You get a trace, and then you put everything through a mass spectrometer, and also I used a nuclear magnetic resonance spectrometer as well to try and work out what these things were. The attractant work that I did was completely different, but obviously still involved chemicals and wasps' perceptions of those chemicals. And this is me at the Bendix Bittermint factory at Winchester, just up the road from Southampton. So I just would hop on my bike, get on the train and cycle to the factory and do my research. And these were special traps that I baited with different fractions of ginger, because I discovered very early on that ginger was a natural wasp attractant. And Bendix used, or still use, ginger in some of their chocolates. And so they'd get these huge drums from China of stem ginger in ginger syrup, and wasps would go mad for it. So too, actually, would honeybees. If they're given an easy source of sugar, honeybees will go for it. And this shows some of my results. These were the numbers of different fractions, because I eventually got fractions made on an industrial scale so that I had enough to work with. And these were different fractions of ginger, which has upwards of 600 chemical components in it. As this is not very clear here, I could have magnified that more, but these are the names of some of the components of ginger. And this is a chromatogram that I ran of whole ginger. And fraction 20 consisted largely of a sesquiterpene called zingiberine, which is one of the characteristic flavors and smells of ginger. And it was that wasps were most attracted to. Back to alarm behavior then. Why do wasps sting and what can we do to avoid them? Well, a hornet sting is 1 centimetre long, so it's not surprising that it hurts, even if it didn't put any poison into you. Venom is a very complex mixture, and there are all sorts of components in it that are very cleverly designed to cause the maximum damage when they sting you. So, you know, there are things called kinins, for instance, that increase the blood flow and activity around the site of the sting so that the venom gets distributed more quickly in your flesh. There's histamine, for instance, which is why we use antihistamine. And histamine has the effect of breaking cell membranes, so allowing the venom to spread and do the maximum damage. Well, I discovered that there are 2 main reasons that wasps sting. One is in self-defense, which would probably not surprise you, and the other is this colony defense. If you're lucky enough to be stung away from a wasp's nest, then you're only likely to get stung once. And the usual reason is that a wasp gets into your clothing. If you're having a picnic or you're outside a pub or something like that, you don't notice a wasp gets into your shirt or whatever and crawls about. And of course, most of us are not very capable of sitting still when that happens. You feel you want to do something about it. But I can promise you, if you do sit still and you let the wasp find its way out by itself, it will not sting you. It will only sting you if you move so that your clothes press against it, and then it feels that it's under attack. Also, very importantly, is the smell of food. Because wasps are omnivores, as I've said, because they are looking both for meat and for sweet things, meat for the larvae, sweet things to fuel them themselves, they are attracted to all the sorts of foods that we eat. And because they can't get sweet things very easily from flowers, any source of sugar that's easier to retrieve, they will go for. And of course, we provide it in abundance whenever we're eating outside. And because their sense of smell is so good through their antennae, any trace of meat or something sweet around your mouth or on your hands, they will investigate. So that's why they land on you. And so what I always say to people is use wet wipes or something when you go on a picnic, and especially make sure your children and your grandchildren are as clean as possible when they've eaten something, so that the wasps don't land on them. So that's one situation. And if you flap about as well, you're very much more likely to get stung. It is absolutely true. The people who annoyingly tell you to stop flapping and just be calm, they are right. If you can be as calm as possible, that helps, because any vigorous movement is likely to provoke an attack. The other and more important time that you're likely to get stung is, as I've said, if you're too close to the wasp colony. And that's what my research showed, that this 3-meter radius is very, very important. The pheromone that is given off in the venom of a wasp when it stings it evaporates very quickly. It's a relatively low molecular mass compound, so it evaporates quickly, but it drops below its threshold level of activity round about 3 meters away from the nest. But if you're stung within that 3 meters, any wasp in the vicinity, whether it's going into the nest or coming out, has no choice. And it's as simple as that. I've witnessed it so many times. It swerves, whatever it's doing, it just swerves off course straight to the source of the sting where you've been stung. and stings and bites and gives off more of the pheromone. So lots more stings are likely. And it's such a very definite thing. And I went on to show that there's another pheromone. I couldn't identify it, unfortunately. I didn't have time. But I found that there was something in the Dufour's gland that doesn't elicit attack, but does increase the likelihood of wasps entering the zone of the alarm pheromone. In other words, it's an attractant, effectively. So they're attracted into the zone of the attack, and then they smell the pheromone, and that causes them to home in and attack. And that pheromone, I'll say a bit more about it in a few minutes. So if you're near a wasp's nest, very important, ideally you should be wearing light clothing. So recommendation is that if you're mowing a lawn, for instance, in August or September, and you hadn't noticed that there was a wasp's nest in the lawn, if you're wearing black or dark colours when you mow the lawn and you go over that nest, you are very likely to get multiple attacks. If you're wearing white or pale colours, like pale yellow, for instance, you're very unlikely to get multiple attacks, even though they can smell the pheromone. They are very attracted to dark colours in that situation. They're also attracted to the environs of the nest. Their eyesight is excellent. So when a wasp first hatches from its colony and starts to forage for the very first time, it flies out of the nest, turns round and flies backwards and forwards like that, like a pendulum, fixing the position of the nest in its brain. And from that time onwards, it always knows, it recognizes the vicinity of the nest. It also recognizes the smell of the colony and of its sisters. And I did an experiment that really excited me to prove that. Instead of using cotton wool as my objects for them to attack, I thought, what if I took a wasp from this colony and extracted all the volatile chemicals from it, and then hung it up from a piece of cotton next to one of its live nestmates and dangled them both in front of the nest. Well, I took a whole lot of wasps on dry ice. I killed them on dry ice so that they died immediately and didn't lose any important chemicals. Took them back to the lab, extracted all those important chemicals from them, dried them out so they looked like ordinary wasps again, took them back the next day and hung them up with a live sister and tapped the rod so that if I didn't tap the rod, of course, one of the wasps would be writhing about and moving and the other was dead. So I had to make them both look alive. So I tapped the rod and they both looked alive. And instantly the wasps came out of the nest and attacked the one that didn't smell. It was astonishing. And yet that was their sister. Because it didn't smell, they didn't recognize it. And so that colony odor is really important. And another reason why you're very likely to get stung if you're too close to the colony. And that shows a wasp stinging and biting. I was saying how poor these photos were, and Stephen Bolwell wouldn't thank me for saying this, but he's now a world-famous photographer, and he was my lab assistant at that time, and he took the photos, and I forgot to tell him, A, wear white, and B, don't get too close, because of course I was making these wasps very agitated, and he got stung quite a lot because he was wearing dark colours. But he took these photos. He then, as he became a more and more important photographer, he had a technician, which was Chris Packham. Chris Packham helped him with his photography, but before that, he helped me. And as I say, they bite as well as sting. And there may be also a pheromone in their saliva as well. I couldn't demonstrate that though. Okay, what use are wasps? 10 reasons why we should appreciate them. Well, they're very hardworking for a start and brilliant architects. This shows a common wasp queen in her nest. This is the nest that she started herself, of course, and you'll often find these in your roof spaces and attics, and possibly you've wondered what they are and why they don't get any bigger. It's because the queen has been killed one way or another in that 6 weeks of frenetic work she does backwards and forwards to the nest before she can stay in the nest and leave the workers to do the outside stuff. And there she is, curled round the initial cells that she's built to keep them warm. And you're actually looking up into the nest, because unlike honeybees that build their combs out of wax and at this sort of angle so the honey doesn't run out on vertical combs, wasps build horizontal combs with the cells all facing downwards. So the larvae have to hang on. They have a sticky substance, a sort of hook-like arrangement at the end of their abdomen. They have to hang on, otherwise they'd fall out. This was in my garden shed this April. And that shows the queen. That's Vespula vulgaris, the common wasp. Police car going past as well. But there she is. She does everything at first. She builds that wonderful nest structure and uses different consistencies of paper to make it, make the cells and envelope. And then on the 3rd of May, the nest had died. And this is just showing the remains. And you can see actually a larva still alive in that one and in that one, an egg in that, a larva in that, but the queen had somehow died. And not surprisingly, really. And there's a story around that as well. In New Zealand, as we'll see at the end, one of our species, Germanica, was accidentally introduced to New Zealand in the late 1940s in crates of aircraft parts for the war effort. So again, hibernating queens, and they got there at just the right time to create their own colonies. Well, the environment in New Zealand is so beneficial for wasps. There were no predators, no parasites. They could, in some cases, create giant nests, and I'll come back to that at the end. But they became such a problem so quickly that the Agricultural Ministry of New Zealand put a bounty on queen wasps, a New Zealand penny per queen wasp, if you found one and sent it to them dead. And this schoolboy thought, this is a great idea. I've got my eye in here and I can do this. And he sent hundreds and hundreds of these queen wasps in and got a penny for each one. And the misguided apprehension of the government was that by doing that, you would reduce the chances of the wasps the year after. But they only had to think of it logically. Each nest produces 500 new queens. You only need one of those new queens to produce a colony the year after to keep the numbers the same as they were the year before. So any number of queens you kill in the winter or spring is not actually going to make any difference at all. So that schoolboy got lots of money for nothing. And this is what a mature nest looks like. And this was underground. And it shows the envelope, which is the insulation, and then these beautifully intricate hexagonal cells with their pillars. And those pillars are very tough. Looking up into the nest, here are full-grown larvae. And when they are ready to pupate, they spin silk over their cell, presumably to prevent parasites from getting in, because it takes about a week in this stage to reach adulthood. And this is the sequence. This is a hornet, actually. There's the egg in the top of the cell. These are larvae, a fully grown larva. They're not very beautiful things. A pupa, and a pupa just before it's about to break open, and then you've got the adult hornet. And when they first hatch, they're pale in color, they can't sting, and their wings aren't joined together. They're not hooked together. And they do nursemaid duties for the first 2 or 3 days. Paper making, another brilliant inspiration. This was for the Chinese, apparently. This was how the ancient Chinese got the inspiration to make paper, by witnessing queen wasps chewing wood and other fibers and making them into papier-mâché, effectively. They mix it with their saliva and they carry it between their legs to the nest. And this is the queen that I showed you earlier, applying that semi-liquid papier-mâché to where she's last built the nest. And it is really paper. It really is. If you've ever seen one of these nests or held one, touched one, you'll know. What intrigued me was that it's all very well taking a photo of these in bright light, but of course, nearly every wasp's nest is in total darkness, wherever it is, whether it's underground or in a shed. And I thought, how do the workers especially find where they last put a load of wood pulp? And I'm almost certain that there is some chemical in their saliva that they recognize, a smell. You wouldn't call it a pheromone because it's not altering the behavior of another one, it's altering their own behavior. But they, I think, locate the last spot that they visited by the smell of the load of wood pulp they've just put in. And it explains also why the fully grown nest is of different colors, because the different workers have different sites to get their wood pulp from. The common wasp, incidentally, builds its nests out of rotten wood, so they're very fragile and a sandy color. The German wasp makes a grey nest, which is much tougher because they use sand wood. Pheromones, these behavior-altering chemicals. Well, I've just said building the nest is probably chemically mediated. The wasp attacking this cotton wool is definitely chemically mediated, this pheromone, and I discovered it was something, well, I was almost certain it was this, N3-methyl-butyl acetamide, which is, if there are any chemists among you, you'll realize this is a relatively small molecule, relatively volatile, and it does just the job. I couldn't prove this was the pheromone. It was definitely in the venom sac, along with some other things called spiroacetals. But anyway, some researchers in the United States duplicated my experiments and went on to prove that, yes, this was the alarm pheromone. Trophallaxis. This is the name given to feeding amongst the members of the colony. So the wasps and hornets that are left in the colony, the nursemaids and the queen, have to obviously have a source of food, and the returning workers exchange liquids with each other like this, and that's called trophallaxis, and that makes sure that the pheromone, the colony-specific odor, is passed from one to another. Navigation, the amazing eyes of wasps. I've already mentioned the kidney-shaped eyes, these ones here, but they also have these ocelli at the top. And those 3 eyes are sensitive to the plane of polarization of light. So what it means is that even on a completely overcast day, wasps can see where the sun is through the clouds by using those three eyes. So they can navigate by where the sun is compared to the angle to their nest. And this photo again shows those kidney-shaped eyes and the ocelli between them. Intelligence and resourcefulness. It's tempting to think of wasps as being intelligent. I certainly felt that they were. The first time I took a huge nest from somebody's roof space, I went to this house in Southampton, got all togged up in my beekeeper's stuff, and the owner said, well, it's up in the roof space. And so I went up the ladder into the roof space, and there was this huge nest. It really was vast, and it was all involved with the rafters and the beams. And what I normally did with my nests was either dig them up and put them into a polythene bag, or cut them with a knife if they were in a roof space. And I was thinking, no, I'm not going to do this one. It's too dangerous. Even with my beekeeper's veil on and everything, they'll find a way in. And I was just deciding that, and I turned around to go back out, and I heard this noise, and it was the owner of the house taking the ladder away and shutting me in the attic. So I had to do it. He obviously felt that it was too dangerous to leave it open. So I did take the nest and I put it into a polythene bag, and I don't know what made me think, I don't know, I'm going to put another polythene bag around that. I was driving back to my vestbury, which was about 5 miles away, and I was at some traffic lights, and I heard this chewing noise, and I looked down at the passenger seat where I'd put this enormous nest, and the wasps had cooperated and bitten through the first bag, and they were busy biting through the next. They weren't doing it in random places. They were all focusing on one point. So I just put my foot down and got there fast, because I'd have had 1,000 wasps in the car with me otherwise. And they also appear to be intelligent in this way. This is a hornet larva feeding its adult sister, presumably to stimulate the adult wasp to give its load of chewed up meat to the larva. The larva gives out a drop of fluid, which presumably contains some carbohydrates. We don't know exactly what it contains, but it's very attractive to the adult. And there she is. That's her sister, remember. She's getting that drop from the sister, and then she doesn't appear to have any meat actually there. She might have already given it to it. But anyway, she's getting that drop of fluid from the larva. Well, when I was transferring my second nest into the nest box, inevitably I had to cut the combs out and lie them on the grass before I glued them into the nest box. And that's a tricky thing to do, because you can't push too hard and you've got to wait for the glue to dry. And whilst I was doing that, my established colony, the workers sensed this. They saw the new colony. They went down to these larvae that were all exposed, elicited a drop of fluid from them, didn't feed them. They then hauled them out, chewed them up into pulp, and took them to feed their own larvae. So they got their drop of reward first, but then killed the larvae. So I had to work really fast. They also discovered that if they used the expanded polystyrene that I insulated my nest boxes with instead of wood, it was much easier. Rather than go off and chew wood, why not just chew up the polystyrene and incorporate that in their nest? So part of the nest was made of plastic, effectively. Fame, wealth, and adventure. Well, I got really quite famous around Southampton, because when you're a wasp researcher, you have to advertise for live nests. Well, I put a small ad in the local paper. The editor saw it, thought, what kind of nutter have we got here? Interviewed me, and I was splashed all over the newspaper, and then the BBC got hold of it, etc. So I became quite well known locally, but it did the trick. I got lots of people phoning into the university to say they'd got wasps' nests. Wealth, well, that, my wife still hasn't forgiven me for this, actually. This was 1977. I was asked to give a talk at Beecham's Pharmaceuticals headquarters at Epsom, as it was then, because they were just starting some research on wasp venom allergy, but they knew nothing about wasps, and they heard about me and they said, would I come and talk to them about wasps? So I did. And at the end of it, the boss of the unit said, could you get us a gram of wasp venom? And I said, yes, I could. I knew a way of doing it, but it wouldn't have been easy. And he said, well, how much would you charge? Well, I hadn't a clue, quite obviously, but I phoned a professor of allergy at Guy's Hospital. I happen to know him. And he said, I don't know either, but I can find out. And an hour later, he phoned up and he said, Ben, I hope you're sitting down. I said, why? And he said, well, the going rate for a gram of wasp venom is £100,000. Wow. That was in 1977. And my wife said, well, why didn't you just finish your research then and there and just get wasp venom? It wasn't quite as simple as that. And one of the aspects was that honeybee venom was only £80 a gram because it was so easy to collect. And there were lots of other problems. Wasps' nests, wasp venom varies from wasp species to wasp species. And then there were 7 species in Britain. Okay, most people were likely to be stung by the common or the German, but not everybody. So it wouldn't have been that easy to do. Right, pollination. Well, wasps don't pollinate very much. As I've said, they're not very good at it. They don't have the right mouth parts, but there is one wild plant in Britain that is definitely pollinated by wasps. And when I was up in Yorkshire a year or so ago, I filmed this. It was a windy day, but in a few seconds, you'll see wasps going flower to flower. And that's very unusual to see a wasp deliberately going from flower to flower. And this, I don't know if you can recognize it, but it's figwort, Sprocularea, and it is definitely a wasp-pollinated plant. And it's got those dark reddish-brown flowers of just the right size for a wasp to get some nectar. And bees are hardly attracted to it at all, even though it does have nectar. Right, I'm coming to the end now. Pest control. People always say, what use are wasps? And I say, well, they do get rid of a huge amount of arthropod pests. And I worked it out once that in a square mile anywhere in Britain in the course of a summer, wasps will get rid of 250 million insect pests. That's in just 1 square mile. And I think it's really, really important that they do that. And I'll come back to that quickly in a moment. And this shows a hornet actually dismembering a red wasp. As I say, it will chop the head, the abdomen off, the wings, the legs, and then chew up the thorax, which contains the muscles, to take back to the larva, not the larvae. Now, keystone species, this is a quick diversion, but some of you will know what keystone species are. A keystone is the stone that keeps an arch together. It may not look an important stone, but without it, the arch will fall down. And keystone species in recent years have been discovered in various ecosystems, and this couldn't be further from a wasp ecosystem if it tried, but it illustrates my point. This is one of these kelp forests that you find in the oceans off the northwest United States. And kelp, as you know, is a very tall seaweed, and it can form literal forests. And you get a huge complex ecosystem based on that. Well, people have discovered in recent years that there are key species in ecosystems that act as keystone species. Without those species, the ecosystem is in danger of crumbling. And the keystone species in this is the sea otter. And the reason it was discovered to be the keystone species was because it was so persecuted for its pelt that it was almost driven to extinction, and these kelp forests disappeared, and all the creatures involved in them disappeared, certainly from those areas. Well, the reason is that this creature, the purple sea urchin, although it doesn't specifically feed on the kelp, it has an annoying habit of eating through the holdfast that keeps the kelp rooted to the bottom. And without the sea otters, that are the only things that can eat the purple sea urchins with any success, without those sea otters, you've got this happening, and all the kelp in various regions disappeared. So the sea otter is a keystone species, and I believe that wasps generally are keystone species. They are effectively apex predators amongst the arthropods, and I genuinely believe they do keep our countryside looking beautiful and keep it tidy effectively, as my newspaper article said. I think that by keeping control of all these arthropods, they are doing a great service to the ecosystems that they live in. And so finally, colony defense, or why you shouldn't disturb a wasp's nest. We've talked about that. This is in Italy, and this is the Asian hornet. Remember, that only arrived in France in 2004, but it's now a real danger and a pest. And that shows how big the nests get. And he is in danger, even though he's completely covered in his veil there. And I said that sometimes they make giant nests, especially in places like New Zealand. One nest in New Zealand was found in a pile of sawdust in a woodyard, and they reckoned it weighed a ton and contained about 8 million wasps. So you wouldn't want to mess with something like that. And in Florida, remember I showed you a picture of the southern yellow jacket and the queen? Well, in Florida, they quite regularly get the southern yellow jacket making perennial nests because the conditions are just right. And this shows a video taken a long time ago by somebody who read my thesis, because Florida University asked for a copy of my thesis. He read my thesis and set up a pest control company, and he took this video before videoing was very easy to do. So the quality is not great, but you'll get the gist. I'm assuming the sound will work.
It looks like they're already coming to check me out.
Somewhere in the woods of Central Florida, we promised we wouldn't say exactly where, Jonathan Simpkins is about to tackle the largest yellow jacket nest he's ever seen.
This is amazing. The size of this nest. The numbers are flying around here. This is the largest nest I've ever seen in my entire life. I've been doing this over 20 years. They're all over me.
Simpkins is the owner of Insect IQ. He has a degree in entomology from the University of Florida, and he shot this video himself.
Okay, one sting so far, right in the chin. I just got a little irresponsible here.
Simpkins was called by the property owner to get rid of the nest.
The nest was extremely dangerous because I had so many yellow jackets on me, they kept finding a way in.
Simpkins says the nest was more than 6.5 feet tall and 8 feet wide.
With the southern yellow jacket, they developed multiple queens the second, third, and fourth year. So this nest did not have one queen. It has thousands of queens in there.
And he says it had millions of workers. As Simpkins goes in to check out the nest, the defenders come out to sting him. Just listen as they attack his camera. And even though the nest was in a remote area, he says it could have been deadly if someone walked up to it.
They're all over me. I don't know how long it's going to take for all these to get off of me.
We also can't show you how Simpkins took care of it. That's a trade secret. But after he did the job, the results are obvious.
Second day, you can see behind me, the nest is dead. Totally dead.
That was one to remember.
It was so exciting. It was one of the best times in my business and professional career to deal with something like this.
In previous audiences, I've been asked, well, isn't it a pity that he had to destroy it because it's such an amazing thing? And yes, it is an amazing thing. And if it wasn't causing any harm, then why did he have to destroy it? But pretty frightening. And so these are the two species that I worked on, the German and the common wasp. And just a reminder, to avoid being stung, if you're distant from the nest, keep still, allow the wasp to find its own way out of your clothing if you can bear to, and wipe traces of meat and sugar away from your hands and mouths. Actually, it's not the sugar they're initially attracted to, because sugar is non-volatile and it doesn't have an odor. They associate the sugar with other chemicals that smell, like this zingiberine that gives the smell to ginger. So they have to learn to associate it effectively. And then within 3 meters of the nest, check before mowing or pruning from July onwards, wear white or pale colors. If you're stung, move away quickly but calmly. Don't thrash about, because you will get stung more if you do that. Now, I do have other things I can say about wasps. Perhaps some of you might ask me questions like that. For instance, should you put vinegar or bicarb on a sting? I don't know if you know that one. That always presupposes that you know whether a bee sting is acid or alkali, and the other way around for wasps. Well, good news, a colleague of mine did a test on them. The pH is basically neutral for both. So it doesn't matter whether you put bicarb or vinegar on, both are likely to help, because they're likely to disrupt some of the chemicals in the venom because of their high or low pH. So you can slosh something, either of those, on a sting, whether it's a bee or a wasp. So, should we be afraid of wasps? Well, I don't think so. I think just wary. Thank you very much.